Now, today's question comes from the PSLE Booklet A from 2022. Now, this is typical of questions involving springs, forces, the topic of forces, the extension of springs, the compression of springs. And when we look at questions like these, right, again, we're going to follow the 3 steps. Step number 1 is to identify what the question is asking. Step number 2, let's analyze the information given in the question. And step number 3, we will do our method of elimination. So let's get right into it. Question number 1, which graph shows the relationship between the elastic spring force and the extension of the springs X, Y, and Z? Now we know straight away this is from the topic of forces, and it has to do with elastic spring force. And remember, elastic spring force is the force which is exerted on an object by a spring which is extended or compressed. When we look at this concept, right, and when we look in particular to the spring, right, there's some things we need to know. Now, a spring, there's 2 kinds of springs. We call it a stiffer spring, and we have something called a less stiff spring, or we can call it a more elastic spring. And there's one important difference between these 2. A stiffer spring, and compare it to a more elastic spring, what happens to a stiffer spring is when the same amount of force is acting on them, a stiffer spring will compress or extend lesser. And in order for me to be able to extend both the stiffer and the less stiff spring to the same amount, I need a greater force to be acting on them. If I want them to extend to the same amount, I need a greater force acting on the stiffer spring. So now, let's look at these. Now, can you quickly identify what force is acting on the spring such that it is extending the spring? Now, remember, if I want to extend the spring, I need to use a pull force, and we see that the pull force in this case is actually gravity acting on these loads. So now let's look at spring X. I have 3 loads acting on spring X. I have 2 loads acting on spring Y, whereas on spring Z, I just have the 1. And if I see all these springs are extended to the same amount, so based on that, I know that the stiffer spring is my spring X, and my most elastic spring is actually my spring Z. Now moving on, applying the same concepts down into this, I know for the same force acting on them, the less stiff spring will extend more than the stiffer spring. So let's look at these options. Let's do the elimination. I know that this cannot be possible because this shows me that the stiffer spring extending more than the less stiff spring. So option number 1 is not true. Option number 2 tells me all 3 springs are extending to the same amount for the same amount of force. Again, option number 2 is wrong. Option number 3 tells me that spring Z, which is the most elastic spring, extends more than spring X, which is good. And even if I compare Y and X as well, it follows that Y is a less stiff spring than X, and therefore it extends more than X. And if I look at this, this doesn't show me an extension. In fact, this shows me compression. So based on our method of elimination, we realize that this option is answer number 3. See you guys at the next video.